From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
I'm Tracy Grant. I'm the editor of Kids Post at the Washington Post. The Post is a proud charter sponsor of this event, and I'm a veteran of this festival. I've done introductions for most of the years that the festival has been in existence. And so I've met, introduced, and heard many, many authors over the years. By and large, they've been wonderful, generous of spirit, engaging, funny. But some years, something special happens. And in 2005, I fell in love at the National Book Festival with this man. Not at all in the romantic sense or anything, but in the sense that hearing this man talk about life and learning, about overcoming adversity, and what the gift of storytelling can help you achieve, gave me goosebumps that I can still feel today. Walter Dean Myers is the author of more than 100 books and has won more awards and honors than I could possibly name. But when he was named the National Ambassador for Young People's Literature by the Library of Congress, I remember thinking that this was the job that this man was born for, and that this country was uniquely lucky to call him our own. It is my distinct honor to present an amazing author and a true national treasure, Walter Dean Myers.
So, is this a good life or what? Is this a good life? The thing that amazes me, I was in, well, let me start. I was going to prisons. I was going to prisons and talking to young people in jail, and I was asking myself, what brought these young people to jail? How did they get here? And I've been thinking about that and worrying about that for years and years and trying to understand and asking myself, what could I do to help some of these young people? And I was thinking, I had some fairly decent ideas, and I said to myself, Walter, you're pretty smart. And I said, yeah, really? Yeah. So. But then one day, I just got up very early in the morning and followed my morning routine, which I get up at 5 o'clock every morning, come downstairs, negotiate my cat's breakfast, and I fed the cat, and I did my 5 pages. I do 5 pages a day. And I said to myself, as I watched the snow falling and real people going to work, how did I get here? How did I get here? You know, my foster parents, I was raised in a foster home, right? My mom read on a 3rd grade level. My dad could not read at all. So how did I get here? Here I am. Now I'm 75 years old. Who knew? You're gonna, 75. I used to think, would I ever make 30? You know. And I've written 105 books. 105 books. Oh yeah. I've published 105 books. I've written 115, 120. I got about 10 books I can't publish. See me later. We'll talk if you have. You know. So how did I get here? Where did the journey start with me? And I believe I have an answer. As my journey started, I had no clue what was going on in my life. I had no idea. I was not the brightest kid in the world. I got to be smart about 2 years ago, but I had no idea. I believe my journey started in Harlem. I left West Virginia at 2 years old, and I was taken to Harlem. And there is a strange woman and a strange man who are now going to raise me. The woman, when she wasn't doing what we call day's work meaning you go out and clean someone's apartment. When she wasn't doing that, she would be home and she would read the only thing she ever read was true romance magazines. And she loved true romance magazines. Here's a tiny little woman. She was about 5 feet tall. And she would read these true romance magazines. And she would allow me to sit on her lap. And I loved sitting on Mama's lap. I was a mama's boy. And her finger would go across the page. And I didn't understand what was going on with this true romance. I could never get my bosom to heave. No. I never looked into someone's eyes and saw stars. My heart never beat faster. What was going on? I did not have a clue. But what I did have was sitting there with my mother. And I would sit there with her, and I enjoyed that going back and forth. I enjoyed the sound of her voice. And I watched that finger move slowly across the page. And I began to recognize a few of the words. I began to recognize words like handsome, beautiful. And I began to recognize some of the words. And I also recognized something else, that this was somehow important to my mother. She liked it. When my foster sisters came home, they had comic books. And sometimes my mother would read the comic books. Again, the finger across the page, her darling son on her lap, and I was a very cute. You can't tell now, but I was. So now I'm watching my mom, and I'm beginning to pick out a few words. And when I picked out the few words, she liked that idea. And eventually, while my mother was doing the ironing or the washing, I could read to her. I could read the words. And sometimes I would not know what the words meant, but I learned to pronounce the words. By the time I started school, I could read. Did I know what the words meant? No. Did it bother me? No. It didn't bother me. When these young people are reading, they will come across words and ideas that they don't understand. It doesn't make that much of a difference. And so I moved on. I moved on to the first grade, Mrs. Dworkin. She was as small as my mother, and I loved her, and she loved me. Went to second grade, Mrs. Bowers, who introduced me to Laura in the Big Woods. I loved Laura in the Big Woods. What people don't understand, that when Laura was being concerned about what was going on outside of her cabin, I was also concerned. I was concerned too. And I was rather nervous. Laura never mentioned me in the books, you know, but I was there. I was there. And what was that doing to me? That was taking me out of Harlem that I loved and putting me into the big woods. Third grade, teacher hated me, I hated her. Fourth grade, Mrs. Parker. Mrs. Parker, white hair, the war was going on, and she would send me to the supermarket to buy sugar. Now, sugar was rationed. And Mrs. Parker read stories about kids riding a train, and I didn't know much about trains, but I rode the train with the kids. You know, it was rather laborious. You know, fifth grade, I got bored with school, and I brought my comic books home. I brought my comic books to school, and Mrs. Conway, fifth grade, Mrs. Conway, found me reading a comic book during a math class, and she came up and tore my comic book up. But she said, if you are very quiet, if you're very quiet, because I spoke a lot in school. I answered every question, you know. So she would let me sit in the back of the classroom and read. And she brought in the books from her library. And the first book she brought in was East of the Sun, West of the Moon. Oh my God. Yeah. This was the most wonderful experience I ever had. So now I'm having all of these experiences. I'm reading all the books Mrs. Conway brought in. She brought in lots of books because she wanted me to sit in the back of the room and be quiet. You know? And I don't know what was wrong, why she wanted me, because I was fairly good in school. I answered all the questions. I advised her what to do every day. If any kid was a problem, I would hit the kid. How could you go wrong with a kid like me in school? And I had perfect attendance. So how could you go wrong with a kid like me in school? Now, by the time I got to seventh grade, I was developing problems because my family became dysfunctional. My family became dysfunctional. My uncle was murdered. My father went through depression. My lovely mother, who drank too much to begin with, became an alcoholic. My family fell apart. And the only thing I had left in my life were the books. I had the books. I could escape into a different world with these books. So I took these books very seriously. I stopped going to school most of the time, but I had the books. And then I began to write. And my writing, I looked back at my first published piece of work. It was so bad. I was hoping it was going to be this little gem that I could share with the world. It was so bad. I know this is my first published poem. I know a lady, oh so fair, to me she gives such loving care. I love that lady like no other, because that lady... You read it? I'm shocked. You read the poem. After all these years. Oh, well. So I began, I went to the books. I loved the books. My school career went down. I was once considered a bright kid. When my family fell apart, I dropped out of school at 15 years old, got caught, put back into school, dropped out at 16, and joined the Army on my 17th birthday. Good idea? Yeah, for a kid who was very immature to begin with, and I was very immature to begin with, it sounded like a good idea. I got out of the Army a few years later, no high school diploma, had nothing going on whatsoever. But I remembered a teacher in high school, and the teacher said, "Walter, you write well. You write well. Continue your writing." So now I'm 20. I'm a veteran at 20, right? 20 years old, a veteran, still fairly immature, still a book lover, and I began writing again. And I wrote anything. My mom started me off with true romance. I began writing for the National Enquirer. You know, I wrote anything, not because I thought I was going to make a living at this, but because it made me feel good about myself. And I had two things going on. I had a love of story. I loved stories. And I had experiences that other kids from my neighborhood did not have. I was with Laura in the big woods. I was with those Vikings. Did you know that when David fought Goliath, I was David's backup? If Goliath had beat David, I was up next. Did you know that? No? Did you know that when I read the Song of Solomon and the Shulamite woman, that was my first affair? Did you know that? Did you know that when I read the portrait of the artist as a young man, and Stephen Daedalus had a disagreement with his mother, and went up O'Connell Street, that he was with me? These experiences have shaped my life. The experiences, you see me here, but you don't know all the things I've been through in my life. When I read The Red Badge of Courage, I ran with Henry through the woods in Virginia. When I read Buddenbrooks, I was with that family in Germany. When I read the Diary of Anne Frank, I have lived a thousand lives. And now what I do is I write. I write 6 days a week. I write 5 pages a day. I tell stories. I tell stories primarily about the era that I grew up in, that troubled era. Because I am drawn back to that era over and over again. I write about troubled teens because I was a troubled teen. I write about worlds of the imagination because that was the truest world that I knew. This is what I do. Every day, I'm up at 5 o'clock, negotiate with the cat for its breakfast. I feed this little cat, and I write 5 pages a day. 5 pages a day comes to what? 5 days a week, 100 pages a month, month after month after month. I write. I've written 105 books. Am I successful at this? I ask myself, how do I measure success? Do I measure success in books published? Do I measure success in the money that I make? Do I make a lot of money? Say yes. Yeah, I make a lot of money. You know, I'm shocked. I'm shocked how much money. I live in New Jersey. I live in New Jersey 10 months or 10 and a half months a year. The rest of it, I live in London the rest of the time. I'm leaving for London. I go home tonight. My wife will pack. Tomorrow, we leave for London Monday. No, I'll be back in the fall sometime. This a good life? Say yes. Definitely. All right, so now you know what I do. I outline every book that I write. I spend, when I finish my 5 pages, which is normally about 8:30 in the morning, 8:30 and 9 o'clock, I finish my 5 pages for the day. What do I do for the rest of the day? Well, I have a wife and the cat. I can aggravate both of them. I take turns. And sometimes I aggravate the cat. Sometimes I aggravate the wife. Both are good. Both. If you have nothing to do, you can come to my house, aggravate either one, which is fine. So what I would like to do now is open the floor for questions. Anything you would like to know about me, about my wife, the cat, writing, anything that you would like to know, you would like to ask me, now is the time to do it.
Yes, good afternoon. My question for you is, was it your personal experience in visiting prisons that inspired Monster or some other events?
It was my visiting prisons. What happens with Monster, I realize that most teenagers don't do a lot of thinking. What they do is to organize their daydreams. They organize their daydreams into viable actions. And many of the kids who are good kids are in jails. And what I wanted to do was to stop the idea of them organizing daydreams and engage rational thinking. I was at a trial one day, and there's one kid by himself with a defense attorney at the trial, one spectator, and this kid was facing jail for the rest of his life. And all of a sudden, there was some noise outside. The high school across the street was letting out. And I knew this kid was the same age as those high school kids. At that moment, Monster was born.
What inspired you to write Shooter?
What inspired me? After the shooting in Colorado, I went out to Colorado and began talking to the kids. And I saw something that was devastating. I saw entire classrooms of kids whose family had guns, and I saw bullying going on. You put the two together, it's an explosive condition.
In Fallen Angels, at the end, when Pee-wee and Perry are flying home, and of course it's a really heart-rending story because you just wonder if they're going to make it. And Pee-wee, who's been so strong through the entire novel, he breaks down, and I find it very moving. Why did you write him that way?
I wrote Fallen Angels. One of my brothers saw me go into the army, and he went into the army, and he went to Vietnam, and he was killed the very first day he arrived in country. And dealing with that idea of people dying dealing with the idea of how do you cope with that? How do you cope with the idea of you killing? And how do you take that killing experience home to your family and your community? That was what was the inspiration for that scene.
Well, I love the character. He's marvelous. Thank you.
Thank you.
I was wondering, what was growing up in Harlem like, and was that the inspiration for some of your books?
Growing up in Harlem was fine, was wonderful for me. Again, going back to the prison experience, I spoke to a defense attorney, and the defense attorney was talking to me about a case, and I said to him, it must be very difficult to get the funds to defend these young boys. He said, no, that's not my biggest problem. My problem is not getting the funds. My problem is to humanize them in the eyes of a jury and to humanize them in the eyes of a judge. And so what I want to do with my books is to humanize my characters. So I put them in Harlem, and I give them families, I give them mothers and fathers, and food to eat, which is typical of what they're doing. I'm trying to humanize them. So what I want my readers to do is to recognize these kids, although they're poor, and although they may be troubled, they're human.
How do you feel being the kind of author's hero for the protagonist in Sharon Creech's Love That Dog?
Love that book. Love that book like a reader loves to read.
I wanted to ask exactly what is the job of the Library of Congress's ambassador to children's literature?
Okay. Here's my medal. You can come. You can come up to me and touch my medal anytime you choose to. It's fine. I am trying to promote literacy around the country. I'm trying to do three things. One, to let people know that illiteracy is growing in this country. It's not getting smaller, it's growing. And there are pockets of young people who cannot read, who do not choose to read. Is a growing problem. It grows in proportion to your prison population. All right, so now, so one job that I have is trying to tell people that books are not just a pleasant overture in your life. It's not like music or opera that you may enjoy. It's essential to your life. The second thing I want to do is to try to teach parents, grandparents, great-grandparents to have dialogic reading with their children. So it's celebrating books, but celebrating books in a different way. If you don't read, you can't. My dad could not read. My dad could not read. His pride was that he could always support his family. If my dad were a young man today, he could not support his family.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I was wondering if you could sign my book, Bad Boy, because you're my favorite author. And
Well, I'll be signing books later.
okay. And what's the best book you've ever published?
The what?
The best book you've ever published?
It's always going to be the next book. It's like, it's like, what's your best girlfriend? The one I got now.
All right, thank you.
In my 8th grade class, we're reading 145th Street, and I wanted to know how much of that was inspired by your childhood. And
Most of it was inspired by either my childhood or by people I've seen, people that I've known. If I meet you and talk to you for more than 10 minutes, you might be in a book. It's true, So we'll talk later.
Hi. First, I just wanted to say thank you so much for writing. We're very honored to have you as our ambassador, and we're all very proud to continually see you recognized. But I was wondering if you could please expand a little bit on what comic books meant to you, why you think they might be an important link to literacy, and why they might be an embedded part of our culture.
I loved comic books because they were accessible. No, they were accessible. They were easy for me to read. They had comic books have a wider variation of language than primetime news. And people don't understand that. Comic books have a wider variation of language. Comic books, okay, there's a tendency toward violence in comic books, which some of the newer ones don't have as much, but comic books are accessible. And comic books had easy answers, and I think that when I get old one day, I might go back to writing comic books. I like comic books. I think they are a literacy tool that can be used.
Hello, I'm from West Virginia, and we studied your book, Fallen Angels, in class. And I was always shocked by the friendship among the soldiers there. Did you experience something like that when you were in war?
Yeah, the first time you see a dead body, you cling to the live ones more. The first time you see a dead body, you cling to the live ones more. Life has a completely different meaning at that point. It's the camaraderie that people acquire. Sometimes it's so difficult to talk about that for years later, guys won't talk about it.
Well, I sort of have two questions. It's like two huge questions that I have, and I'm like debating between which one to ask. Is it okay if I ask both?
Go ahead.
Okay. The first one, me personally, I am currently on a crusade to become the greatest writer ever. And you're one of the greatest writers ever, so I wanted to ask you, for someone who's probably looking into a career into writing and looking to be very successful in writing, I know you was talking about the 5 pages a day, but what other advice would you give to, say, a young writer who is looking to have a successful career in writing?
What I would suggest to you is to get my card, no, yes, and email me.
Wow. Yes, sir.
Yeah.
I get the email Walter Dean Myers. Like,
I worked with to see if it's possible. I worked with a 14-year-old. A 14-year-old wrote to me, and he was a soccer player and he played sax, and he wanted to write, and we worked together for 3 years, putting together a story. I was telling him how to do it, and the book was published about a year and a half ago. And I worked with sometimes middle school kids by Skype and stuff like that. So email me.
Yes, sir. Gladly. And my second question, I'm constantly surrounded by a lot of people who don't necessarily believe in education or reading. Like, I have talks with my dad, and he's just like, yeah, the book smarts and stuff, that's whatever, but you got to have real hands-on experience.
Okay.
And like, that sort of thing I completely agree with, you know what I'm saying? Like, being able to have life experience and things of that nature you do need to have. But whenever I get into, like, the explanation of why reading is essential to life, like, help me out.
Okay. All right. Number one, I just finished a book about this same subject. It's called Darius and Twig, but it'll be out in another year. But the point of the thing is that the world has changed since your father was young. It's changed since I was young. So when I was young, I could go out. I was strong. I was a lot bigger than I am now. I could make a living because I had a willingness to work. Those jobs, those same jobs, are now in China and other places in the world, and they're not going to come back. They're not going to come back. It's a different world. Life experiences are fine, but the modern world is going to be the world of information. You will use, manipulate, and learn about everything that's going on through reading, through reading, through reading. You know, and no, no. It when I hear someone saying that reading is boring, I say we have failed that child. We have failed that human being. And when you think that someone says someone's not bright enough to read, that person's failing that child.
Thank you.
And this is the last question, because my keeper is giving me dirty looks. Yes.
Well, as a teacher, I wait for April to teach Love That Dog to my students because of the accessibility it brings for poetry and things. And I'm just wondering, if this were a tent full of just teachers, what would you say to them, one thing that you would say to them to help them to inspire children to want to write? I know the reading part of it is so essential because they're so connected, but just the writing part of it.
Okay, I'll tell you one last little thing, and then I'll leave. I worked with a group of kids in Texas, and I gave them a 15-page project. I love this project so much. The first 10 pages, I asked them to do a family history. I gave them family oral questions to ask, and they could use the answers to the questions. They could use photographs. 10 pages of family history. Those kids were shocked to find out what their parents were like. And the last 5 pages, 10 pages of family history, and 5 pages of how they fit into that family history. I did not think much of it. I mean, I work with young people. I didn't think that much of it when I began. By the time I ended, those kids were writing to me. Their families were writing to me. And it was the best thing that ever happened to them. And it was an award-winning program, and it was a great program. If you do family histories, that's where to start. Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.